All right. It's good to be back in Detroit. It's always good to be in Detroit. And good to see familiar faces. So one of the things we wanted to do with this particular deep dive is not have it be a monologue. You all have probably seen some of the data. The report's been out for a while, but to really also generate some conversation. And that's the part of this discussion that I am particularly looking forward to. As we think about when we were doing the design of this study, and I see so many familiar faces from our partners and stakeholders, and we said, well, when we get data and we figure out what we want to ask, and we know and we have the answers, what are we going to do and how can we use the data as that common premise? And I think today is also kind of a manifestation of that, walking out those objectives that we started out with this particular study and saying, what does amplifying Detroiters' voices do for the process of decision making for particularly you as leaders, and how you can leverage now that we know and we've heard from residents, how can we leverage these data to create deeper understanding of how people's lives are going, where their expectations of change lie in terms of where they want to see change in their lives so that they can achieve equitable life outcomes. And so I think that the fact that we're in this room is such an incredibly encouraging point to be at. As Jim mentioned about being the first, we've approached a number of cities, we had some pilot cities, so being the first to actually kind of walk this proof of concept, which is engaging residents into this process, listening to those experiences, quantifying those experiences, and now having data to help with that decision making, I think is the part that gets me giddy. One of the things we started out, and so for some of you all, is to really kind of put a frame around the questions we ask, and to that single thing is, how are people doing? And so we have the measure on the study that really kind of allow for us to assess what we will call a subjective measure of overall well-being as people rate their life, evaluate it in their life. So this is a structure in the form of measuring overall well-being. There are other measures of well-being that probably look at some more health outcomes, more driven around those aspects. But using the life evaluation question is an aspect of measuring subjective well-being. And we wanted to do that for Detroiters. And so it's a question that we ask on the survey. And so we ask Detroiters, to rate their current and their future lives. And what that allows for us to do is to be able to quantify and to bucket whether or not individuals are thriving, struggling, or suffering. And so from the answers to those questions on our life evaluation measures, we're able to understand a little bit more about residents and what that looks like for residents in Detroit as far as overall life evaluation. So when we think about thriving, and what that means, it's really, well-being that is strong, consistent, and progressing. And what we see for Detroiters specifically is that Detroiters who are thriving, think about their outlook, which is their future life, because we ask them 5 years from now where you think you would be on that ladder, also optimistic about what their life will be like 5 years from now. And that's that description of what's happening where we're seeing the Detroiters who are in this thriving bucket, what we see in terms of the other questions around their everyday experiences that we're asking and what's happening in their lives. The other thing in terms of struggling is really well-being. It's moderate, or there's some inconsistency, right? I might be doing well in some aspects of my life, might be good on the physical sense, but financially, there's some worry and some concern there. But what we know from Detroiters is that those who are struggling in their well-being, they're mostly satisfied, so there is some level of satisfaction with the education system and the availability of healthcare and good jobs in the area where they live. Most of them do not feel, however, that they have what they need in order to achieve their career and financial goals. And what we see here also is that they're also more likely to be dissatisfied with the availability of housing in their neighborhood, right? So individuals, again, based on where you're scoring on that ladder, that are falling in, this is what we know characteristically about how they're rating their lives on those other areas where we're asking about their experiences. For suffering, this is really well-being that's at high risk. What we see from Detroiters who are suffering in their well-being, these are the folks that are least likely to be satisfied with the availability of good affordable housing where they live. Few feel that they have what they need for their career and financial goals. So when you start to think about, having the things that you need in order to prepare yourself for the future, and you'll hear us talk a little bit more about that as we go deeper in the data, they're also more likely to report having health ailments. There was a series of diagnoses that we ask on the survey from a physical health perspective, what we see is that individuals who are falling within this bucket based on the measure, we see that they are more likely to have health ailments, and about 2 out of 3 of them do not believe they can get ahead with hard work living in Detroit. All right, so the numbers. So what we see overall in being able to look at it, we see 50% of all area residents, so thinking about the region, that give life evaluations that would allow for them to fall in that thriving bucket that I just described, right? So overall for the region, it's about 50%. Well, how does this compare to what we know and see in our national data? So we know for Black Americans, it's slightly lower, it's 52%, but when we start to think about mathematics, it's pretty much very, very similar in what we see on national trends, both for the US population as well as for Black adults in the US overall. So we see 50% of all area residents that are falling in the thriving, an additional 45% that are in that struggling bucket, and 5% that's in suffering. One of the things as we started to think about going deeper in this data for this conversation is, well, where are those aspects? Who rather is more likely to be thriving in Detroit, and what does that look like from a racial and ethnic breakdown, but also when we look at it across city residents, where are those pockets of thriving? So when we see in terms of who's more likely to be thriving, when we look at city residents, we see that white residents are more likely to be thriving in their overall well-being than Black residents, and Hispanic residents in the middle, very similar to what we see among white residents. However, what we see in terms of a pattern and a trend is that those that are 65 years or older are much more likely to be thriving. So those city residents that are 65 years and older are much more likely to be thriving. And this will come up as we go deeper in the conversation about what does that mean for young Detroiters. And particularly when we look deeper into these data, we see that this idea of optimism for the future, so how you're rating what your life will be like 5 years from now, that's some of where we're seeing some of that differences by age playing out a little bit, where we see less likely to be optimistic about what my life would look like 5 years from now among younger Detroiters. Okay. One of the things that we also, so now that we know how people are doing and we have a framework to put around it, which is this overall well-being framework, is, well, what are those determinants? What are those things about our everyday experiences or about Detroiters' everyday experiences that are, driving or determining how they rate themselves on that latter question, right? So whether it's particularly around currently, what is it about what I'm experiencing in my current life that's determining whether I'm giving a 0, between a 0 and a 10. So what we see, and this is in order of importance, is what we see is that economic opportunity. So individuals' responses about the view that they have about their ability of getting ahead by working hard. If Detroiters rate this item particularly high, we see that they're much more likely to also rate their current life evaluation high enough to be falling in that thriving category. The other most important category is really around their overall satisfaction with the availability of jobs and the availability of job training services. So you start to think about that lever. Do I have what I need in order to kind of give myself a chance to be successful through the elements of what I'm able to do, what I'm qualified to do, and the overall availability of jobs that are available to me in my area. The other thing is education, particularly around the access to high quality public schools and the ability to leverage opportunity to achieve their career and financial goals. So when we see Detroiters who are able to rate these items really high in terms of their overall satisfaction with the quality of the educational system or the access to quality schools, and or feel like they have an ability to leverage opportunity to achieve their career goals, much more likely to rate their overall current life evaluation really high and high enough to be falling within the thriving bucket. There are other elements that are important other than economic opportunity, access to jobs and work, and education that also comes out in how Detroiters' everyday experiences are impacting how well they rate their lives today. And that's around health and well-being, particularly as it relates to access to quality health care, satisfaction with the availability of quality health care in the area where they live, and particular community aspects of the community and environment where they feel like they live in a neighborhood where people care about each other and their overall satisfaction with neighborhood services and conditions. And I want to just take a pause here because you'll hear us talk about neighborhood services and conditions quite a bit throughout this deep dive. And that's particularly around the services that are available to you in your community and your neighborhood, as well as your access to build social capital, whether that's through recreational, access to recreational opportunities, access to markets with fresh fruits and vegetables, neighborhoods that are free of blight, the ability to rate neighborhood services like fire and snow removal and air quality really well. So this is the aspect of the environment in which I live in is driving my current life evaluation. And the one thing I'll add here is where justice show up. This is really an important factor for individuals living in the suburbs. So less so much for residents who live in the city. This element of justice and satisfaction with overall law enforcement was important, but came up as an important driver for residents who were living in the suburbs and less so much for residents living in the city. All right, so the next question was, who is more likely to want to move away? We had that in the question that we asked on the survey. And we also wanted to understand to what extent about people's everyday experiences that might be contributing to who wants to leave and who wants to stay. That was the next element to say, okay, what does that look like in terms of what Detroiters are planning to do? And so we asked the question about, if you had the opportunity to move away in the next 12 months, would you do so? What we see in terms of the data here is that Hispanic residents are most likely to say that they will continue living in Detroit. And 43% of city residents would prefer to continue living in Detroit, while 57% said that they would move permanently to another area if they had the opportunity. And we'll talk a little bit more about where it is that people are thinking about moving and why they're thinking about moving. And so when we see in terms of city residents specifically, 46% say that they would go somewhere else in the city of Detroit or to the Detroit suburbs, rather than outside of the metro area. So there's an element of, might not be getting what I need where I'm currently living, and this is kind of my intention. When we look in terms of city residents who say they would want to move permanently to another area, race, ethnicity, we see that Black city residents are significantly more likely to say they would want to move to another area, with 58% of Black residents compared to 50% of white residents and 47% of Hispanic residents. All right. So why do people want to move? Well, the most common reasons that we see in terms of why people want to leave the city is crime. So we see 62% said that they would want to leave because crime is too high in the area. And to round out the top three, people are looking for a better place to raise their children. And that's where the aspect of education and the quality of education comes in. And that's probably why we see that connection to how people are grading their current life evaluation and contributing to whether or not they're thriving. It's an important element to say, I want a better place to raise my children. What does that look like? I think education and the access to education and the quality of the education system plays a little bit into people's perception of what's a better place. The other thing is also to have job and business opportunities that are better elsewhere. As we go through the presentation, we'll look a little bit into this better place to raise children, but what does the business opportunity look like as well? All right. So what do we know about those who are most likely to move? So we did a regression model to say, well, who are these people who are, kind of making up that 57%? So when we see for city residents, they're most likely to be Black residents and young people, 18 to 34, compared to those that are 35 years or older that are more likely to say that they want to move. These are residents that have lesser amount of education, so those with less than a graduate degree. Those who are not homeowners, and those who have what you would consider a lower social connection as measured by the number of close friends you have living in your neighborhood, and those who have not lived in the city for a very long time. So those are the people in terms of building out to say, well, who do we see that, what do they look like that those individuals who are saying that they want to move out of the city? And so this aspect of social capital, we see that that was an important predictor. The number of friends that you say you have that are residents that are living, number of close friends that you have that live in your neighborhood, we see that that was an important predictor of whether or not individuals wanted to move away from the city or not. Okay? All right. So one of the things that we wanted to do was then say, okay, all right, so we know your ability to build social capital or to increase your social capital as measured to the number of friends was an important predictor of your likelihood or not likelihood to want to move away. And so when we map that across Detroit neighborhoods and we see that residents that was living in St. John, Boynton, and Davidsonville, that this is where we were saying the individuals were reporting having the highest level in terms of the number of friends that they have living in their area. So if you wanted to use that as a proxy for social capital, so this is where we see social capital as measured in the number of close friends were highest in those communities, in those neighborhoods. All right. Next thing I want to talk about is economic opportunity. You notice that in addition to your perception of being able to get ahead being like the #1 determinant for overall thriving, we want to talk about economic opportunity and what we see in the data through economic health, entrepreneurship, and economic mobility. Particularly when we look at, we created this measure, so we had a series of questions that asked people about different aspects of their lives related to financial security, housing security, the ability to pay for your basic needs. And what we created was this economic health indicator. So in order to have high economic health on this measure that we created, you would have to have had responses to questions that you said that you had a level of comfort, so you would have some level of comfort with being able to live on your present income, that you said that you had not worried about money in the last 7 days, and that you had what you think you had some of what you need in order to achieve your financial goals, that you said that you had enough money in the past 12 months to pay for healthcare, housing, and food, and that you felt satisfied with your standard of living. So if you were able to score positively on those questions, we consider or counted you as having high economic health on this indicator measure that we created. When we look at that measure and we divide it up into quartiles, we see that 63% of city residents in the bottom of the economic health indicator group are those who are also saying that they would like to move away permanently. Okay? All right. So when we look across this economic health indicator item for city residents, we see that 19% of Hispanic residents are falling in the top quartile versus 13% of Black residents and 6% of white residents. So I know before the question comes that this is something that also seems, well, how is that the case? One of the things that we see coming out, particularly when we look at the data by race ethnicity, is this aspect of when we put in the ability to build social capital and access to high quality neighborhood services and that particular variable, we see that when Black and Hispanic residents are able to give those items a 5 or to rate them high, that they were much more likely than white residents to be in the top quartile on the economic health indicator that we created. All right. This other aspect about, what do people see for opportunity? So when you think about the things that are impacting Detroiters' current life evaluation, this ability to access economic opportunity is a big and important driver. So we wanted to look at the questions that we've asked that could be a proxy for what are people seeing for opportunity. One of those questions was we asked the question about, whether or not you plan to start a business within the next 12 months. So what we see in terms of all Detroit city residents, about 13% of city residents say that they were planning to start a business within the next 12 months. So when we look a little bit deeper in terms of who's saying, among that 18% that's saying that they're looking to start a business in the next 12 months, we see that 79% of those individuals are Black residents, 7% Hispanic, and 6% white. Overall, though, what we see is that Black residents are twice as likely as white residents to say that they are planning to start a business in the next 12 months. And you see that distribution by age in terms of who's interested in or who told us they were interested in starting a business in the next 12 months. Well, what does that look like in terms of the questions we ask about what are some of those barriers and impediments that they see? So what we see in terms of what current business ownerships look like, and we see that overall, 15% of Black residents own businesses currently, are business owners. We see that, again, overall, 18% are planning to start a business. But when we ask people about whether you have the resources you need, so overall, thinking about all city residents, we see 81% say, of those who are planning to start a business, say they do not have the financial and non-financial resources to start a business. But particularly, even though we see higher interest among Black residents are almost 2 times more likely than all other residents to say that they do not have the resources that they need to start the business that they want. So when you start to think about, how are people accessing and leveraging and perceiving opportunity in the city, we see that when it comes to this case study of wanting to start a business, we do see some disparities in that desire and whether or not people think that they have the resources to do so. All right, I'm going to turn to Dan. We'll talk a little bit more about this case study about what we see in the Detroit data related to the drivers of well-being, but also related to...
Can I make one comment?
Sure. All right, we'll do comment while we transition.
Hello?
Yep,
I went on my own little search. I didn't know what the origin of economic energy was. The very, very origin. So not fiscal tools, not government, just where does it, and the very origin is when a business starts. Not many people know that. In the United States, when we were really doing our best work was between 1870 and 1970. Left-leaning and right-leaning economists all agree, but America exploded. This city exploded. And we invented everything and changed the world and all that. Now we don't do it so much. But what happened is startups have slowed. And so during the real good times, we were starting about 600,000 a year with an employee. And now it's gone down to about 385,000. But if you said, how do you put America, Detroit, or I'm originally from Nebraska, all over Nebraska, you get people to start up. But this is one of the damnedest things I think I've seen at Gallup. We got the list of the Inc. 500 fastest growing companies 2 years. Those were really valuable Americans. They start real fast growing companies. The more those you have, the more this place booms, the more good jobs you have with a living wage and all that kind of a thing. But and most of them cooperated. Let's say we had 600 or 800 of them. We're trying to figure out how they think differently than the regular people to see if you could match it up. And big surprise, they have huge determination. They run through walls. But this is the finding. When God has handed things out, he hasn't handed them out evenly. One is speed. Somebody's the fastest in this room and somebody's the slow. You see what I mean? But he was very egalitarian when he handed out the traits of building a business. And if so, the question is, how many Steve Jobs types do you have down in these areas of these kids? The answer is 5 in 1,000, and it's the same with any population you look at. The president of Mexico, Peña Nieto, had us test 80,000 poor Mexicans. I emphasize poor, because poor is different there than what Americans think poor is. And it was exactly the same. And what you could do is you could match them up with those same thought patterns and life themes. Do you see what I mean? But then the trick is to spend all the time and invest the money in those types. I'm going to crudely compare it to sports. So in a high school 5-star quarterback's coming out of Los Angeles or whatever, everybody wants. But see, you could do the same thing here. But I would encourage you, one of your takeaways is I get real interested in who the entrepreneurs are, because that's where the magic is. And it's really best if economic energy comes up and out of the people there, the hearts and minds of the people, rather than the government helping. That's from a guy that likes free enterprise, but I think that's what I was going to say.
Is there an opportunity to ask questions, or we're saving that for later?
Yeah, we're going to have a whole discussion, Stephanie, and also I should have said, all these slides are going home. And I'll be quick through this section because I know everybody's got questions they want to get into.
So Camille asked me to do this part, I think, either to rest her feet or because I'm a social scientist by training. And one of the things that we wanted to really start thinking about today, so we discovered a lot about the current state of how people are doing. But we want to start thinking about what do we do about that? And where do we go from here? And what can this data do to inform the kinds of local policies that are going to help change things on the ground? And Jim, your point about entrepreneurship is a great example of this idea of economic mobility, socioeconomic mobility. This is something most people in the room are probably familiar with. Have probably heard research on this to some extent. And what's interesting is that as people are studying this, they're trying to understand what are the factors. This one way of looking at it is that allow somebody to live the American dream, which is I'm going to do better than my parents did, right? We want our kids, the next generation, to be able to do better. Well, if you look at it, in some parts of the country, in some parts of the world, kids who grow up in poverty are significantly more likely to be able to move up out of poverty than in other parts. You look across the US, you can highlight all the counties and you can see the variation. And so the researchers have studied what are the factors in a community that make a difference to that. And that's the right-hand of the slide here is an example of some of those key factors. So this is not exactly sort of the standard model, but it's a good analog to the data we've collected here. And the basic idea is that you need to have some good things in place. You need to have some basics covered in your community, but you really also need to have the opportunity to go and do something. And so education is a huge part of this. Access to opportunity is a huge part of this as well. Social connections between people of different social classes, of different groups. So like equality of connection is a huge factor. This is another one in the research that has been really interesting lately, is that who your friends are. This is something Nicholas Christakis is a social scientist out of Yale who's done a lot of this work, but who your friends are is more predictive of what your life outcomes are going to be than what the income of the neighborhood you grew up in was. That those connections make a big difference, and it's because people are seeing things, they're seeing role models, they're getting access to opportunities, they're getting introduced to people. There's a lot that goes into that. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at, within the survey, what were some of the questions that could map up and align with some of these drivers that we care about. So the first way of looking at this kind of overall concept of economic mobility, is looking and saying, among these domains that we really care about, so education and employment opportunities, access to neighborhood services, social capital, and satisfaction with neighborhood qualities. If we look at all of those together, this is like 24 questions that we've taken an average across all of these neighborhoods. This is what overall economic mobility looks like within the city. People in different locations have a different likelihood to have access to the kinds of things that are predictive of them being able to move up and to be successful. And what we wanted to do then is dive into each of these domains as well. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of maps here. Again, thinking about as we look at this data, it's one thing to see an overall score and say, well, that probably looks like a lot of maps that you've seen in the city that line up with other factors. But we can start looking at those subdomains, and what we start to see is there is variation. And so if you follow a particular neighborhood as we look through here, in some neighborhoods, they're going to have higher satisfaction with quality and aesthetics. And so these are things like abandoned buildings in the neighborhoods, satisfaction with snow removal, and fresh air in the community. How beautiful is the area where you live? People have different perceptions of this in different locations. Social capital, another good example here, where in different parts of the city, we're going to see different patterns, different neighborhoods. Some are going to be doing better on these social capital measures. Some are going to be struggling a little bit more. When we talk about social capital, the questions in the survey, these are where we're getting into things like, do you have a lot of connections in your area? Do you have people you can count on? These sort of positive connections and community attributes, right? How do you feel about the people you live with? How do you think people feel about the city as a whole? The next piece is that neighborhood services example. And so this is, you can think about the first neighborhood one as more of the basics, the things that you need. The services, we're getting into things like transportation here, access to outdoor recreation opportunities, access to local markets. Again, we're seeing some variation, and we haven't at this point gone and really tried to dig into specific neighborhoods, specific communities, and say, what's the case study for this particular neighborhood and get under the hood of it. That's part of what we want all of you to help us with, is to think about, okay, as you're doing your programs, as you're thinking about when you're targeting a neighborhood, how do we start lining this data up and saying, well, this particular neighborhood over here, this is what the profile of need looks like in this area. How can we make sure that we're ensuring the programs are reaching people in this area, that are really meeting the needs that they have? And then over time, are we tracking progress in these areas? So how are we prioritizing and then tracking that outcome? Last one here, this is self-explanatory, education and employment opportunities. Again, we see a lot of variation across the city, and we see that this pattern is changing. Again, if you're kind of hot-spotting these neighborhoods. The other thing I want to call out, I probably should have done this at the start, but the maps that you've seen throughout here are sort of just brute buckets, right? We're just looking at the bottom third, the middle third, and the top third. So there's even more variation that we're not seeing here. If we were to show the absolute values for these particular neighborhoods, some parts of the city are doing a lot better than other parts of the city. We just wanted in this presentation to have a really quick way to be able to see kind of good, okay, and struggling in that sense. And then the other thing I wanted to leave you with before we get into the discussion piece is just taking that last one, so education. And one of the things, you know, we've talked about a lot of these outcomes, but something that's unique about doing the survey work is you've got lots of hard statistics on things like graduation rate, right? Everybody can go out and you can look at school quality ratings, and there's a lot of those outcome metrics that we know about. But what we don't know if we don't go talk to people is how that's affecting their perceptions of where they live and their thoughts about the future and their plans for what they're going to do. And so here we're looking at really just two questions on this slide, but really the focus. We've already talked about sort of overall satisfaction, so just 30% of residents are satisfied with the quality of the educational system or schools in their area. But then if we start diving in and we ask this question, this is a hard-hitting question, whoever wrote this one, do you think children in your neighborhood would be better off or worse off if they attended a school in a different area from where you live? And within the city, the plurality, 44%, think that kids would be better off if they lived in a different neighborhood. That's a heck of a statistic, right? And what we know then is when we think about things like people who want to relocate out of the city, who want to move to the suburbs or move to a different part of the country, is if you look in the bottom left, we're looking at those who just parents, basically, children in the household. We don't know for sure if they're the parents of those kids, but there's children in the household. And we see a couple of things. One is that 50% of those with children in the household think that their kids would be better off in a different neighborhood, a different school district than the one that they're in right now. And the other thing that we see is that the overall, you don't see this on the graph, but the percentage of don't know is a lot smaller. So those don't knows you see in the top, that's a lot of people who are saying, well, I haven't thought about the schools in the area because I don't have kids, or that's not a priority of mine. But the people who are thinking about it really see that this is an issue. And what we're excited to start thinking about now with all of you is what are the other examples from the data that you've heard about today, from the priorities that you're working on, where we could start really diving deep into some of these issues and understanding, hey, at the local neighborhood level, the specific questions that really matter, they're going to help you make better decisions with your programs. And then in addition to that, the other thing I want to be thinking about, something I think is exciting for year two, is we also know that a lot of you have great data. And right now we've got this one data set. It's a great data set. We're really proud of it. We're really excited about what there is to learn there. The plan is we're going to go collect this data again, which, as Jim talked about at the start, it's one thing to know where you stand today. It's something entirely different to know if we're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction over time, and again, how that variation looks. But I'm also really interested to think about what's the data that you all are collecting or that you're relying on today, and how can we start pulling those data points together and doing some more of the modeling work, trying to really understand, let's look at some of those hard outcome indicators, let's look at the survey data, let's go out and let's think about what new questions should we ask to fill that out, and how can we really make sure that we're continuing to just hone in at greater and greater precision on the issues that are really going to make a difference for this community in the long run.